Liuzzo was born on April 11, 1925 in California, Pennsylvania. Her father was a coal miner and her mother was a teacher. Her family was very poor when she was a child, so they had to live in shacks with no running water. She moved around a lot as a child, and as a result, she never finished school at the same place she started it that year. When Liuzzo was in 10th grade, she dropped out of high school against her parents' wishes. Years later, when she was 16 years old, she ran away and she married a much older man. However, the marriage only lasted one day. A few years later, she moved to Michigan, where her parents lived. There, she worked as a waitress, and that is where she met her second husband, George Argus. And together, they had 3 kids. Unfortunately, after 7 years of marriage, they decided to get a divorce, and Liuzzo got custody of her children. A few years after her divorce, she remarried James Liuzzo, and together they had 2 boys. Over the years, she began to regret dropping out of high school, so she enrolled in night classes at Wayne University. She studied political ideas, debate, and civil rights. One day, Liuzzo's African-American housekeeper and friend, Sarah Evans, suggested to her to join the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. This organization furthered the rights for the African-American people. Liuzzo accepted her offer. The day, March 7, 1965, is known as Bloody Sunday. This is because on this day, over 600 civil rights supporters and activists tried to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery. When the marchers were attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were bombarded by state police officers. They were shot and beaten. Many people died. Students at Wayne University were outraged because of the Bloody Sunday. They held a march of 250 students, including Liuzzo. This became her first act in the civil rights movement. A few days later, she heard of another march on the 21st of March in Selma, Alabama. She wanted to help out, so she packed a small grocery bag with her things and called her husband and her housekeeper, Sarah. They tried to persuade her to change her mind, and so did her daughter, Penny. Penny said, "Mom, I have a terrible feeling I'm not going to see you anymore." Then Liuzzo replied, "I need to be there." Despite their warnings, Liuzzo traveled to Selma, Alabama. When she arrived to Selma, she worked as a receptionist in the Brown Church. While she was there, she met a 19-year-old boy named Leroy Moten, who was planning to march that Sunday just like her. The march took place on Sunday, the 21st of 1965. The turnout was huge. Over 3,000 people showed up. There were people from all ethnicities, religions, and races that came to show their support for the civil rights movement. Some of these people included Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. Liuzzo marched the entire first day, and that night she traveled back to Selma to sleep. She returned to her fellow protesters the next day with 4 miles left in the march. Finally, the group reached the Alabama State Capitol. Then, Martin Luther King Jr. made a speech to the 25,000 people that had gathered there. The march had concluded, but Liuzzo wanted to help out more, so she gave rides to the marchers, driving them from Montgomery back to Selma. After she had dropped off the final marchers, she and 19-year-old Leroy Moten drove to Selma on Highway 80. During their trip back, they stopped at a red light and another car pulled up next to them. 4 white men were sitting in the car. As Liuzzo pulled away from the red light, she noticed that they began to follow her. She tried to lose the men, but they stayed right behind her. At last they pulled up very close to her car and they fired. Their car swerved into a ditch and the 4 men drove away. Liuzzo was shot in the head and killed that day, March 25, 1965. However, Leroy Moten survived by playing dead. The next day, March 27th, President Lyndon B. Johnson broadcasted on the television that Liuzzo's killers had been found.
I am certain by now that all of you know of the horrible crime which was committed last night between Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. I have been in constant touch with the Attorney General and the Director of the FBI, Mr. J. Edgar Hoover, throughout the night on this matter. Due to the very fast and the always efficient work of the special agents of the FBI, who worked all night long, starting immediately after the tragic death of Ms. Viola Liuzzo on a lonely road between Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. Arrests were made a few minutes ago of 4 Ku Klux Klan members in Birmingham, Alabama, charging them with conspiracy to violate the civil rights of the murdered woman. Mr. J. Edgar Hoover, our honored public servant who is standing here by me, has advised that the identities of the men charged with this heinous crime are as follows. Eugene Thomas, age 43, of Bessemer. William Orville Eaton, age 41, also of Bessemer. Gary Thomas Rowe, age 31, of Birmingham. And Collie Leroy Wilkins Jr., age 21, of Fairfield, Alabama.
Liuzzo's killers were named Eugene Thomas, Collie Leroy Wilkins, William Eaton, and Gary Thomas. They all belong to the Ku Klux Klan, a group of white supremacists that are against the rights for African Americans. Thomas and Wilkins served 10 years in prison. Eaton died before he could serve his sentence, and Rowe was granted immunity and was cleared of all of his charges because he worked for the FBI. The governor of Michigan met with Liuzzo's family. He said Liuzzo gave her life for the rights of humanity. Her funeral was held on March 30th, 1965. Over 350 people came to pay their respects. Shortly after her funeral, the FBI started sharing stories that Liuzzo was cheating on her husband with Leroy and that she was a horrible mother. The Liuzzo family was outraged, so they filed a $2 million lawsuit against the FBI, accusing the Bureau of hiring and telling Rowe to kill Liuzzo. However, the judge ruled the FBI had nothing to do with Liuzzo's death, so they lost the case.
Wasn't afraid of it.
Do you think he's the one who killed Viola Liuzzo?
I think Gary Thomas Rowe was the one. The Ku Klux Klan FBI informant, I think he was the one. He's telling people that Wilkinson killed her, but I feel that Gary Thomas Rowe.
Viola Gregg Liuzzo's murder had a very important effect on the civil rights movement. It prompted President Johnson to start an investigation to end the Ku Klux Klan once and for all. Also, Detroit made the week June 1st through 8th the Viola Gregg Liuzzo Commemoration Week. She was honored in several other ways as well.